The darkness in the cell was not complete. A thin grey light, the first suggestion of dawn, stood in the high window like water behind a gauze curtain. You could see the lines of the stone blocks, the black hook where your cloak hung, the small wooden cross above the door, and nothing else. The air smelled of cold wool from your blanket, dry rushes on the floor, and the faint, dusty sweetness of old incense that lingered in your habit even after weeks of wear. You had known that smell for as long as you had been here. It was as familiar as your own breathing. You placed both feet on the stone floor, finding the coolness a comfort rather than a shock, and reached for the tunic that lay folded over the wooden stool. The wool was thick and dark brown, made from the fleece of the monastery's own sheep, carded and spun and woven by brothers who worked in silence. You pulled it over your head and settled the shoulders into place, then tied the simple cord at your waist. The rope had been given to you on the day of your profession, and its fibers had softened over time into a smooth, gentle knot that never slipped. You put on your leather shoes next, 2 worn pieces of cowhide that shaped themselves perfectly to your heels, and you stood. The walk to the scriptorium began in the cloister. You left your cell and closed the small wooden door behind you, a door so well fitted that it made no sound when it swung, only a soft breath of air against the frame. The corridor outside was long and narrow, lit by the same grey dawn leaking through unblazed arches on the inner side where the garden slept. You walked with a steady pace, the soles of your shoes whispering on the flagstones and the cold wrapped around your ankles and wrists, but did not trouble you. The cloister was empty at this hour. All the other monks were still in the choir finishing lauds, and you had been given a special permission years ago to begin work early, so that the gold leaf might be laid in the best morning light. The silence was not absolute, for you could hear the distant, thin chanting of psalms behind the chapel door at the corner of the cloister, a sound like bees in a hollow tree, constant and drowsy. You passed the central garden, a square of earth where rosemary and lavender grew in tangled profusion, even now at the end of autumn, their grey-green leaves frosted with dew. A single drop of water fell from the stone lip of the well into the basin below, and the sound was a small round note that punctuated nothing, a moment of wetness in the quiet. The sky above the cloister was now the colour of unspun wool, a pale grey that promised no sun for hours. You breathed in the mingled sense of damp herbs, wet stone, and the faint animal smell of the cow byre beyond the outer wall, and then you turned left through a second archway toward the scriptorium. The scriptorium building stood apart from the main cloister walk, connected by a short covered passage where the light was always dim. The walls here were thicker, built to keep the interior steady and cool for the vellum, and the door at the end was made of dark oak, with iron hinges so silent that they might have been greased yesterday. You pushed it open with the flat of your hand, feeling the grain of the wood smooth as polished bone, and stepped inside. The first thing that met you was the smell, the clean, slightly animal scent of scraped calfskin, the mineral tang of inks, the dry dust of chalk and pumice, and underneath it, all the faint honey-like sweetness of gum arabic that sat in a covered pot on the shelf. The room was not large, holding only 6 writing desks arranged in 2 rows, each slanted toward the high windows that faced north. The light that entered was grey and soft, falling evenly across every surface without a single shadow, the perfect light for reading small letters. No one else was there, and the 5 other stools stood empty, their cushions flattened by yesterday's labour. Your own desk was the second from the left, nearest a window that looked out over the lower fields and, far away, a line of dark hills. You walked toward it without haste, running one finger along the edge of a neighbouring desk as you passed, feeling the tiny notches left by a stylus that had slipped centuries ago, and then you arrived at your place. A wooden stool with a thin leather cushion waited for you, its legs slightly uneven on the stone floor, a problem you had long ago solved with a small wedge of oak placed under the back leg. You sat down, and the cushion accepted your weight with a soft sigh of dust and feathers, settling you into the exact same angle you had occupied for 18 years. The desk before you was covered with a clean linen cloth that protected the work you had prepared yesterday. You lifted the cloth carefully, folding it once, then twice, and set it aside on the small shelf under the desk. The parchment page lay revealed, and the sight of it, even after all these years, calmed something deep in your chest. The vellum was the color of pale cream, its surface smooth but not glossy, with a faint nap that caught the light when you tilted your head. The page had been ruled the day before with a lead stylus, leaving fine, almost invisible lines that would guide the text. And the text itself, a clean Carolingian minuscule, marched in rows of brown letters across the upper and lower portions of the page. The ink was dry now, a deep, quiet brown that matched the earth of the garden, and each letter stood with the small, careful serifs that your hand knew by heart, A's and C's and T's, and all perfectly spaced, the words flowing without interruption. At the very center of the page, a blank space waited. It was a square of untouched vellum, measuring perhaps 2 finger widths on each side, and inside that square, traced with a dry stylus so lightly that only you could see it, was the outline of the capital letter B. The 2 rounded bowls of the B stretched upward. The central spine stood straight, and the whole shape was surrounded by faint spirals where the vine stem decoration would one day curl. This letter would begin the first psalm of the new book, Beatus Ver, Blessed is the man. You looked at the waiting B for a long moment, thinking of nothing, only letting the shape sit in your mind like a stone resting in still water. The silence inside the scriptorium was deep, deeper than the cloister, because the thick walls smothered all echoes. But if you sat very still, as you did now, you could hear something else. It came not from inside the building, but from far beyond the valley, a low, unbroken murmur that had no beginning and no end. Something like the sound of a distant river in flood, but made of human voices. You had first noticed it 3 days ago, a hum that drifted through the hills on the wind, rising sometimes to a faint cadence and then falling back to a steady, featureless wash. The brothers who went to market said that a great crowd had gathered in the meadow near the town, that a man from the north was speaking to them day after day under the open sky, but no distinct words ever reached the scriptorium, and you did not lean toward the window to listen. The sound was too far away, a part of the world that lay outside the pages of your book, and so it became, like the wind or the distant lowing of cattle at the horizon, a thing you heard without hearing, a constant note beneath the quiet. You adjusted your position on the stool, shifting your weight a little to the left so that your shadow did not fall across the vellum. Then you looked at the tools lined up beside the desk, the horn of ink, the goose quill pens resting in a clay beaker, the small knife for sharpening, the pumice stone for smoothing mistakes, the glass vial of gum water, and the tiny clay pot of burnishing powder. They were all in their proper places, and you did not need to touch them yet. The first task of the morning was simply to sit and let the cold light reveal any flaws in yesterday's preparation, to examine the gesso ground that you had painted inside the letter's outline with the finest of brushes. You could see it now, a faint raised shape the color of chalk, still slightly moist in its deepest layer, but dry enough to receive the gold later in the morning. You passed one fingertip above it without touching, feeling the coolness of the gesso rising to meet your skin, and you knew that it was ready. Outside, the distant murmur paused for a moment, as if the speaker had drawn a breath, and then resumed its unhurried flow. A bird called twice from the garden, a small, quick song that vanished into the grey air. You folded your hands in your lap and waited for the light to strengthen just a little more, for the bell of prime to ring softly behind the chapel door, for the world to turn another degree toward the gold work that lay ahead. The bee waited on the page, and you waited with it, the two of you sharing the silence like 2 calm travelers resting beside a quiet road. The bell of prime came and went, a small, tidy ringing that brushed against the scriptorium walls and faded, and you did not rise to attend the office because the permission that allowed you to begin work early also exempted you from the daytime hours when the gold was waiting. You heard the distant shuffle of sandals in the cloister as the brothers crossed from chapel to refectory for the morning meal, a soft, dry sound like leaves moving over stone, and then even that faded, and the scriptorium returned to its deep, holding quiet. The grey light from the high window had thickened just enough for you to see the grain of the vellum more clearly now, the tiny, wandering paths of hair follicles that crossed the page like the map of a country seen from a great height. You bent forward and placed both hands flat on the slanted desk, feeling the wood's cool, waxy finish under your palms. a surface that had been burnished by the sleeves of all the copyists who had sat here before you. Then you straightened and reached for the small shelf beneath the desk, where you kept the tools wrapped in a piece of undyed linen. You lifted the bundle with 2 hands and set it on the right side of the desk, the side you always used for preparation, and unfolded the cloth slowly, spreading it flat so that each tool lay in its own small hollow of fabric, a resting place it had occupied for years. The goose feather quill was the first thing your fingers found. You lifted it and held it up to the window light, turning it in a slow circle. The feather was a soft brown grey, barred with darker lines at the edge, and the shaft had been scraped clean of all its barbs except for the last plume at the top, which was left for balance and beauty. The tip had been cut into a neat square nib yesterday after you'd finished ruling, and you now inspected its sharpness by pressing it very lightly against the pad of your thumb, feeling the faintest prick of resistance. It would need only a single stroke of the penknife to bring back its crisp edge, and so you laid it down again on the linen, aligning it with the straight edge of the cloth. The penknife itself was next, a small blade of iron set into a bone handle that had yellowed with age and the oils of your hand. You opened the blade, which moved on a simple iron pin, and tested the edge on the same thumb pad, finding it true and clean. Then you closed it and set it beside the quill, its handle pointing toward the window so that the bone would catch the light. The knife had been made by the monastery's smith, a brother named Martin who had died 7 winters ago, and you remembered his quiet, soot-darkened face each time you used it, a memory so familiar that it had become part of the tool itself. The horn of ink came next. You picked it up with both hands, because the horn was a little larger than a hen's egg and slightly heavier than it looked, made from the hollowed tip of a cow's horn, sealed with a wooden plug at the base and a fitted cork at the top. The outer surface was black and ridged, polished smooth in the places where your fingers always gripped it. You pulled the cork with a gentle twist and brought the horn close to your face, not to smell it, for the iron gall ink had a sharp metallic scent that you knew well, but to see the surface of the liquid inside. The ink was dark and still, with a faint oily gleam along the top, and you could see that it had settled overnight into a denser layer below. You set the open horn upright in the small clay socket that had been built into the desk for that purpose, and then you took the short glass stirring rod that lay beside the ink beaker and swirled the liquid with 20 slow, steady turns, counting them in your mind until the ink was uniform again. The small whirl of dark liquid slowed and flattened, and you withdrew the rod, wiping it on a scrap of waste vellum that you kept for blotting. The small clay pot of water was next to be prepared. You lifted its lid, a simple disc of unglazed clay that fit without a sound, and looked inside. The water was perfectly clear, drawn from the monastery well just this morning by a novice who had risen even earlier than you. A single tiny bubble clung to the side of the pot, and you watched it for a moment without thought, waiting for it to rise, but it did not. You replaced the lid and moved the pot to the upper left corner of the desk, where it would be within reach, but not in the way of your working hand. Beside it you placed the linen rag, a square of old soft cloth that had once been part of a worn-out alb, cut and hemmed by the tailor brother. It was white now only in memory, stained with years of ink and pigment and gold dust in a fine all-over pattern of grey and brown and faint yellow. The gum arabic vial you lifted with special care, because it was made of thin glass from the workshops of the East, fragile as a bird's skull. The glass was greenish and full of small bubbles that had been trapped when it was blown, and the light passed through it softly as through deep water. Inside, the gum arabic was a thick, honey-coloured liquid that moved only when you tilted the vial very slowly. You did not open it yet, for it would not be needed until the colours were mixed, but you set it in its own small hollow in the linen bundle where it would not roll. The burnisher came last, and you handled it with the same gravity you would give to a relic. It was a piece of polished agate, a stone the colour of the grey sky, but shot through with faint bands of milky white, and it had been shaped into a smooth, curving tooth that fitted perfectly into a turned wooden handle. The handle was dark with age and use, and you could feel the warmth of the wood as soon as you picked it up, as if it had been holding the heat of your body through all the hours since yesterday. You laid the burnisher on the clean linen cloth, not on the bare wood of the desk, so that its polished surface would pick up no grit, And then you looked over the neat row of tools with the quiet satisfaction of a farmer surveying a well-planted field. The book of exemplars, the collection of model letters and decorated initials from which you drew your designs, was already on its lectern at the far end of the desk, a heavy volume bound in oak boards and covered in dark leather that had split along the spine. You did not need to open it today, for the pattern of the capital B had been set in your memory for weeks, but its presence was a comfort, a witness to all the hands that had copied from its pages since the time of the monastery's founding. You rested your eyes on its closed cover for a moment, noting the tiny scar where a candle had once fallen against it long before you came, and then you returned your attention to the page before you. The pumice stone you now took from its place, a small porous grey block that felt as light as a dried sponge, and you passed it very gently over the surface of the vellum around the waiting bee, not to scrape, but to smooth any stray roughness that might have risen overnight with the damp. The stone made a sound like a faraway whisper as it moved, a sound so soft that you felt it more in your fingers than you heard it with your ears. And when you finished, you brushed the invisible dust away with the side of your hand, letting it fall onto the floor, where it would be swept up at the end of the day. Then you took the linen rag, dampened one corner of it with a drop from the water pot, unwiped your fingertips one by one, starting with a thumb and moving slowly to the smallest finger, removing every trace of oil and dust that might later interfere with the gold. The light had grown again while you worked, not dramatically, but enough that the grey of the morning had given way to a colder, cleaner white, the kind of light that comes when the sun has risen behind a bank of cloud and has not yet found a gap. The window above you showed a rectangle of blank sky, and you could see, if you lifted your eyes, the bare branches of the walnut tree in the inner garth, motionless and dark against the white. A single crow sat on one of the highest branches, a shape like a piece of charred wood, and you watched it for a few breaths before it dropped away and vanished, leaving the branch trembling in a way that was too slight to be seen from this distance. The distant sound beyond the valley had not stopped. It had become part of the morning, as constant as the running of the mill stream that you could also hear when the wind was right, a low, woven noise of many voices that you did not try to separate or understand. Sometimes it seemed to move a little to the east, sometimes it settled lower in tone, as if the speaker had paused for a drink of water or a breath, and then it would lift again, a rhythmic rise and fall that came through the walls, not as language, but as a texture, a layer laid over the deeper silence. A brother walking past the scriptorium door would have called it the crusade preaching, but inside this room, with the gesso waiting, and the gold still folded in its little book on the shelf, it was simply the murmur of far-off people going about a far-off business that had nothing to do with the letter B. You now shifted your stool a fraction to the left, sliding it without lifting so that the wooden pegs scraped only a little on the stone, and you sat down again with your belly close to the desk's edge. The warmth of your sitting had been transferred into the leather cushion, and it welcomed you back with a small, familiar softness that made your shoulders drop a fraction lower. You looked at the gessoed bee again, studying it the way a gardener studies a bed of earth before planting. The raised white shape was completely dry now, you could tell, because the surface had lost its faint, damp sheen and had become uniformly dull, like fine chalk left in the sun. You touched it with the very tip of your clean little finger, and the gesso felt smooth and slightly cool, with no give under the light pressure. It was ready. Before you could lay the gold, you had to apply one more thin coat of a special size to make the leaf stick, a mixture of gum arabic and sugar and water that you kept in a tiny shell sealed with a dab of wax. You retrieved this shell from the small recess in the wall behind your desk, a niche that had probably been meant for a lamp, but that you had long ago claimed for your most delicate things. The shell was a scallop, pale pink and white, brought back from a pilgrimage to the sea by an earlier abbot and given to the scriptorium for just this purpose. You cracked the wax seal with your fingernail and peered at the size inside, a clear, sticky liquid that looked like very thin honey but smelled faintly sweet and vaguely animal. You dipped a fine brush into it, a brush made from the tail hair of a stoat, and you painted the size over the gesso in a single unbroken stroke that followed the outline of the bee exactly, covering the raised boss without spilling onto the flat vellum around it. The brush moved as if it were an extension of your breath, steady and slow, and when you finished, you set it aside and watched the wetness glisten for a moment before it began to dry, turning tacky and receptive. Now the gold waited, the little book of leaves that sat on the shelf below the window, wrapped in a square of silk that had come from the same eastern roads as the gum-glass. He reached down and took up the booklet, handling it only by the edges, and placed it on the desk beside the waiting letter, still wrapped, still closed, a small rectangle of deep crimson silk that glowed softly in the muted light. The ties that held it shut were simple linen threads, and you did not undo them yet. They would wait until the size was exactly as tacky as a finger pressed against a drying grape, at which moment the gold would be lifted and laid. That moment was still a little way off, and so you sat back on your stool, folded your hands in your lap once more, and allowed yourself to become still again, listening to the crow that had returned to the walnut tree, the creak of the old lectern in the corner as the wood adjusted to the cold, and the soft, unending rumble of voices far beyond the hills, a river of sound that flowed without ceasing through the winter morning. The page before you was not merely a surface but a small, quiet country, and now, with the size drying to its perfect tack and the gold still wrapped in its crimson silk, you allowed yourself to look at that country as a whole, travelling its pale fields without hurry. The vellum, held at the edges by the weight of 2 smooth river stones wrapped in leather, lay flat against the slanted desk, with a slight natural curve at the right margin, a gentle rise like the lip of a shallow bowl, a memory of the animal's spine that even the scraping and sanding of the parchmenter have not quite removed. You had learned long ago that every skin kept a little of its living shape, a faint topography that the hand learned to read just as it learned the rise and fall of a familiar stair in the dark. The colour of the page was a warm cream, deeper than milk, but lighter than butter, and it seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it, glowing dully under the grey sky that came through the window. When you tilted your head slightly, the surface showed a soft velvety nab, the countless tiny raised fibres of the skin that had been lifted by the scraping knife and then flattened again by pumice, so that they lay all in one direction like a field of grass after a steady wind. Running your gaze along the nap from top to bottom, you could see the faintest tracks of the hair follicle pores that had once held the calf's fine reddish coat. Each pore a speck no bigger than a grain of sand, arranged in patterns that wandered and looped without repetition. A secret map left by the animal's life. The parchmenter had done his work well, for the skin was even in thickness and showed no scars from insect bites or thorns, only that tranquil, granular orderliness that made a page worthy of scripture. The ruling lines, drawn with a lead stylus that left a silvery trace rather than an incision, divided the text block into 2 neat columns, and you could see where the stylus had paused at the beginning of each line, leaving a tiny dot of metal that caught the light if you looked very closely. The lines were perfectly horizontal, checked against the prick marks that the binder had made in the outer margins with a needle, little holes that you now located one by one along the left and right edges, 3 small perforations for the vertical boundaries, then rows of paired holes for each line of writing, every hole clean and round and evenly spaced, the work of an expert hand. You touched one of the prick marks on the left side with the pad of your middle finger, feeling its tiny ragged lip against the smoothness of the vellum, and then you traced an invisible line across the column to its twin on the far side, a distance that your mind measured without effort because it was the exact width of the scriptorium's standard page, a dimension fixed by custom long before you were born. Within these ruled columns, the text had been written out in a Carolingian minuscule so precise that it seemed to have been printed by some patient machine rather than a human hand, though that hand was your own. You let your eyes rest on the first few words of the psalm, simply looking at the shapes without reading their meaning. Beatis via qui non ebit, the A, like a tiny open purse, that, with its crossbar a hair's breadth above the stem, the stats that trailed its tail downward in a small perfect curve. Each letter was distinct and unadorned. The inked dark walnut brown that had soaked cleanly into the fibres without feathering, the work of a morning 2 weeks ago when the air was dry and the quills were sharp. The text flowed across the page in a dense, orderly river, the words separated by a space no wider than a fingernail, and at the end of each line the scribe you had made small, careful adjustments so that the right margin was almost as straight as the left, an artistry of compression and expansion that no one but another scribe would ever notice or praise. Between the two columns of text, in the exact center of the page, lay the blank square where the capital B would one day proclaim the beginning of the psalm with gold and color. And around that square, the lines of minuscule parted like water around a stone, flowing above it and below it, but never touching the sacred emptiness where the illumination would live. The blank space was not perfectly empty, because you had already traced the B into the vellum with a dry stylus, a technique you had learned from an old brother who had since gone blind, whose memory now lived only in the neatness of your letter forms. The tracing was a whisper on the skin, a slight burnishing of the surface that could be seen only when the light fell across it at an acute angle, and it served as a guide for the gesso and then for the gold, a faint ghost of the letter that hovered just beneath the layers yet to come. You leaned closer to the page, so close that you could smell the faint, clean animal scent of the skin mixed with the dust of the pumice you had used earlier, and you examined the outline of the B stroke by stroke. The central spine was straight and true, rising from the baseline of the text to the full height of the capital, while the two bowls on its right side swelled outward with a gentle, confident curve, the upper bowl slightly smaller than the lower, as tradition demanded. The whole letter sat in a subtle harmony of proportion that you had learned from the exemplar book, a geometry that had come down through centuries from the scriptoria of Tours and Aachen, and you could feel that harmony in your body when you drew it, a rightness that settled into the bones of your hand. You now took up the dry stylus again, a simple rod of polished bone no thicker than a goose quill, and you traced the outline of the B once more without pressing, letting the point follow the ghost lines like a singer humming a familiar melody under his breath, a rehearsal for the gilder's tip and the brush that would follow later. The stylus moved slowly around the upper bowl, down the central stem, around the larger lower bowl, and then up into the loose spirals of the vine that you would eventually paint in white and green. The motion was so familiar that you did not need to think about it, and your mind drifted momentarily to the sound that still murmured in the distance like a river in its bed. That sound had not changed in any essential way for the past 3 days, but now, as you sat very still with the stylus resting between your fingers, you noticed a new quality in it. The low, constant hum had always seemed to be a single mass of noise, but today, perhaps because the wind had shifted slightly to the east, you could almost separate it into layers. There was a deeper, rhythmic pulse that rose every few moments. A voice lifted above the others in a pattern of speech that paused and resumed, with the regularity of a bell. It was not singing, exactly, and it was not shouting. It was a kind of oratory that carried a long way, the vowels stretching out across the bare winter fields, the consonants softened into almost nothing. You understood that this was a man speaking to a great gathering of people, and that the words must be in the common tongue because the cadences had the rough, emphatic beat of a market sermon rather than the polished Latin of the choir. The words themselves, however, never reached you. They dissolved in the cold air, losing their edges before they passed the monastery's outer wall, so that all you truly heard was a rise and fall of tone, the shape of language without its content, like listening to a conversation through a thick wooden door. You did not strain to hear better. That was a rule of the scriptorium, a rule that had been taught to you in your first year by the same blind brother whose stylus you now held. The ears must remain open but passive, receiving whatever sounds the world chose to deliver without chasing after any one of them, because the work of the hand demanded the whole of the attention, and any distraction, even a curiosity, could lead to a trembling quill or a misplaced leaf. So you let the distant preaching sit at the edge of your awareness, no more significant than the creaking of the walnut tree or the occasional soft thump of a wooden door closing in another part of the monastery, and you returned your eyes to the page and the waiting letter. The vellum, under your continued scrutiny, revealed even smaller details, the kind of details that only a copyist's eye could find. Near the bottom left corner of the page, in the margin below the last ruled line, there was a faint smudge, an irregular patch of slightly darker cream that was not quite as clean as the rest of the skin. You had noticed it many times before, because this page had been lying in the scriptorium cupboard for over a year, waiting to be part of the new psalter, and the smudge had likely been there from the time the skin was scraped. But today, with the light just so, You saw that the smudge had a shape. It was the ghost of a thumbprint, a small oval of whorls and loops left by a hand that had held the page too soon after touching something greasy, perhaps tallow from a candle or oil from a lamp. The print was not recent. It had yellowed slightly, settling into the fibers with a permanence that no amount of pumice could remove. And you wondered, in the idle way one wonders about small things, which of the old brothers had left it behind 20 or perhaps 30 years ago. It might have been the cellarer, who was known to wander through the scriptorium checking on the supplies with an unlit candle in his hand, or it might have been the apprentice who had died young from the fever and whose name you had never learned. The print was simply there, a silent mark of someone else's presence in this room, a tiny accident that would now be bound into the Holy Psalter and carried down through centuries, and the thought, though it contained no drama, settled into your chest with a soft, calm weight. You moved your attention upward again, past the ruled columns and the minuscule text, and you let your gaze rest on the blank square and its dry traced B. The gesso you had laid earlier, a raised boss of white that exactly covered the interior of the letter, was now a clean, matte shape that bulged slightly from the page, like a shallow relief. You inspected its edges without touching them, looking for any crack or bubble that might have formed as the gesso dried, but there was nothing. The mixture you had prepared the previous afternoon had been of the right consistency, not too thick, not too thin, and it had bonded to the vellum's nap with a tenacious grip. You could see where your finest brushstrokes had left a slight texture on the surface of the gesso, a faint brushmark pattern that would be completely hidden once the gold was laid, and you knew that this texture would help the gold adhere by giving the leaf a slightly rough bed to lie on, like fine cloth spread over a mattress. The size you had painted over the gesso was now at that precise stage of tackiness that experience had taught you to recognize. When you pressed the pad of your little finger very gently against the surface, it resisted just slightly, pulling at the skin with a clean, dry adhesion that left no wetness behind. The gold leaf, still waiting in its silk-wrapped book on the desk beside your right hand, would be lifted and placed at exactly this moment, when the size was neither too wet, which would drown the gold and dim its luster, nor too dry, which would cause the leaf to flake off later. But you did not reach for the gold yet. There was time, a little pocket of stillness that had opened in the morning like a clear pool between two stones, and you did not want to rush out of it. The letter had waited for months to receive its gold, and it could wait a few minutes more while you sat with it in this quiet companionship. The light crept a little further across the desk, the sun having risen now just high enough to clear the eastern range of the monastery roof, though it still hid itself behind the layer of cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon. The quality of the illumination in the room changed by a small degree, becoming slightly warmer, slightly less grey, as if a thin wash of honey had been brushed across the air. In this new light, the minuscule letters on the page seemed to gain a subtle vitality, their brown ink taking on a reddish undertone that came from the iron salts in the gall liquid, and the blank space where the B waited seemed to pulse faintly with its own potential, a promise of gold that the eye could almost anticipate. Beyond the scriptorium walls, the distant voice continued its unhurried pattern, rising and falling, a human sound that had become so much a part of the background that you would have noticed its absence more than its presence. A second speaker took over at some point, you realized, because the pitch dropped slightly and the rhythm changed from quick, emphatic phrases to a slower, more deliberate cadence, like a different instrument playing the same piece. The crowd, if crowd it was, responded now and then with a low murmur that rolled through the valley like the sound of a distant wave withdrawing over pebbles, and then the voice would resume, and the murmur would subside, and the whole cycle would begin again. It was, you thought, without attaching any feeling to the thought, probably something to do with the journey to the holy places that the men from the north had been talking about for many months, a subject that had reached even the silence of the cloister through letters from the bishop and the occasional visit of a travelling prior. But the details did not interest you, and you let the sound be simply a sound, a long, breathing note on the far edge of the world's song. You now took up the dry stylus one final time and traced the outline of the B in the air just above the page, a small silent rehearsal of the motion you would make when the gilder's tip approached the gold leaf. The muscle of your hand knew this shape so deeply that you could have drawn it in the dark, could have drawn it in the water with your finger, could have drawn it in the dust on the road, and you let the stylus move through the empty space with the same unhurried precision, a dance of the knuckles and the wrist that was as much a prayer as any spoken word. When the tip returned to the starting point at the top of the central stem, you set the stylus down on its linen bed, straightened your back against the stool's small support, and breathed out a long, slow breath that misted faintly in the cold air before vanishing. The page waited. The bee waited. And you waited with them, suspended in the calm morning that held no urgency and no end. Only the steady, patient pulse of the hours as they turned like great, slow pages of their own. The gesso ground that now sat on the page, a clean white boss tracing the outline of the bee, had not always been there. It had arrived through your own hands on the previous afternoon. And as you sat in the quiet of this morning with the gold still waiting and the distant murmur rolling through the valley, your mind drifted back over that slow, careful work, retracing each step like a tongue revisiting a familiar hollow in a tooth. The memory was calm and full of small details, a peaceful catalogue of actions that had filled the hours between none and vespers while the scriptorium lay in its own late-day hush. The raw materials for the gesso lived in a locked cupboard in the corner of the scriptorium, a cupboard of dark oak that opened with an iron key kept on a cord around your neck. You had gone to that cupboard after the midday rest, when the other brothers were still in their cells or walking the cloister, and the key had felt small and warm from its long contact with your skin. The lock turned with a soft click, and the door swung open to release a dry, mineral smell, the scent of chalk and lead and bone that always reminded you of the road to the quarry where the brothers sometimes walked on summer afternoons. Inside the cupboard were jars and boxes and linen bags, each labelled with a strip of vellum in the house, scribe's hand. The letters brown and precise, SLA said lime, white lead, surga, fish grew, bolus armenes, 50 million, lapis lazuli, fish grew, bolus armenes, 50 million, lapis lazuli, and many more. A silent apothecary of colour and texture. The slate lime you took down first, a clay pot with a fitted lid that had been dried from the kiln only last spring. You removed the lid and looked at the white powder inside, a floury, matte substance that had been made by burning limestone in the monastery's own lime kiln, then slaking it with water from the well and drying the resulting paste in shallow pans under the sun. The powder was the colour of a winter cloud, and when you stirred it with the tip of a clean feather quill, it moved with a soft, weightless resistance, puffing a tiny, invisible cloud into the air that made you sneeze once, quietly, into your sleeve. You took a small brass spoon from a hook inside the cupboard door and scooped the lime into a clean scallop shell, counting in your mind until you had the right amount, a heap no larger than the first joint of your thumb. The white lead came next, stored in a solid little box of turned beechwood with a screw-top lid that squeaked as you opened it. The lead inside was not a powder but a crumbly cake, pale and dense, the colour of fresh cheese curds before they are pressed. You scraped a portion from the edge of the cake with the brass spoon, letting the fine particles fall into the shell beside the lime, and the two white substances lay next to each other without mixing, like two separate drifts of snow that had fallen on the same leaf. The lead had been made by a brother long ago, a process of hanging thin sheets over vinegar in a sealed pot for many weeks until a white crust formed, and every time you opened the box you thought of that old brother, whose name was forgotten, but whose handiwork still served the scriptorium after 40 years. The sugar was kept in a tiny glass bottle with a ground stopper, a luxury that the cellarer had obtained from a merchant in the south. You pulled the stopper with a careful twist, and the small sound it made was a clean, high note, like a single tap on a glass cup. The sugar was a coarse, yellow-brown grain, not the fine white powder that the abbey received at Easter, but a rougher kind that the illuminators preferred because it dissolved more slowly and gave the gesso a longer working time. You shook a few grains into the shell, 20 or 30 small crystals that gleamed dully in the dim light of the cupboard, each one a tiny, irregular jewel. The fish glue, or isinglass, was the final ingredient, stored in a waxed linen wrapper inside a small lidded pot. When you opened the pot, the smell rose up immediately, a faint marine scent of old fish and river water, not unpleasant but distinctly alive, a reminder that this clear, brittle substance had come from the swim bladders of sturgeons that swam in the rivers of the East. The glue had been dried into thin, translucent sheets that crackled like autumn leaves when you broke off a piece the size of a pea, and you laid this fragment on top of the other powders in the shell, where it sat like a shard of glass on a bed of snow. You carried the shell to your desk with both hands, walking the short distance from the cupboard with the measured steps of a man carrying a full cup of water, though the shell was not yet mixed. The desk had been cleared in preparation, and the shell now rested on a small iron trivet that you had placed beside the page, a trivet with 3 curved legs that kept the shell steady and level. Beside it you set the candle stub that you used for gentle heat, a short, thick candle of beeswax that had been burning in the refectory the previous winter, and had since found its way into your collection of useful things. You lit the candle from the ember in a small clay warmth pot that the novice renewed each hour, and the flame rose up straight and yellow, barely flickering in the still air. The mixing began with the candle placed under the trivet, so that its flame licked the bottom of the shell without touching it. You added a few drops of water from your clay pot, using a small glass dropper that you had made by heating and drawing out a broken tube, and you watched as the water pooled around the powders, darkening them to grey and then to white again as they absorbed the liquid. The smell of the warming blue began to bloom softly, a clean, slightly sweet scent that rose over the candle's honeyed note, and you stirred the mixture with the blunt end of a porcupine quill, moving it in small circles that slowly, patiently persuaded the powders to dissolve. The shell grew warm under your fingers, but not too hot, a gentle heat like a stone that had lain in the sun, and the stirring continued without haste while the slaked lime and the white lead lost their separate identities and became a single smooth paste. The sugar melted into the water without fuss, and the fleck of isinglass, which had begun as a hard little chip, softened gradually into a clear, shimmering blob that you nudged with the quill until it merged completely with the white paste, leaving no trace. The mixture began to thicken under the warmth, taking on the consistency of heavy cream or thin butter, and you lifted the quill from time to time to watch a droplet fall back into the shell with a slow, elastic stretch that told you the glue was binding everything together. When the paste could be stirred without resistance, you removed the shell from the trivet and set it on the cool stone of the window-sill, letting the warmth subside so that the gesso would not set too quickly on the page. The brush you used for applying the gesso was the finest you owned, a brush made from 3 hairs of a red stoat's tail set into a goose quill handle, no longer than your smallest finger. You had made this brush yourself, binding the hairs with a silk thread and fixing them into the quill with a grain of pine resin, and it had served you for 4 years without losing its point. You dipped the brush into the warm gesso and lifted it, watching the white paste cling to the tip in a tiny bulb that did not drip, and then you brought the brush to the page, resting the heel of your right hand on a small wooden bridge that spanned the vellum so that your skin would not touch the writing. The first stroke was made along the central spine of the B, a straight line that rose from the baseline to the full height of the capital in one smooth, unhesitating motion, the brush depositing its white load with a slight, velvety drag that you could feel in the bone of your finger. You watched the gesso settle onto the vellum, a ribbon of white that stood slightly proud of the surface, even in its wet state, and you knew from long experience exactly how much paste to lay down, so that the dried boss would be high enough to catch the gold, and not so high that it would crack when the page was later bent. The brush returned to the shell, picked up another bulb of gesso, and painted the upper bowl of the B, following the curve that the dry stylus had traced earlier, and then the lower bowl, each stroke meeting the central spine with a clean, sharp junction that left no gap and no overflow. The smell of the gesso, as it dried, was a faint, chalky odor, like the smell of a clean, whitewashed wall after rain, and this scent mingled with the wax of the candle, the dust of the vellum, and the distant cool breath of the autumn air, that crept through the window. You worked with a steady rhythm, a rhythm so slow and even that it was almost a form of breathing, and your mind did not need to direct the brush because your hand knew the shape of every letter as a tongue knows the shape of a prayer. The gesso filled the bowls of the B until they were solid with white, and then you added a little extra at the central angles where the spine met the curves, building up the height in those places so that the future burnishing would bring out a brighter gleam in the hollows and corners. The vine stem decoration that surrounded the letter had not yet been painted, but the gesso for it you applied now as well. Delicate trails of white that spiraled outward from the B into the margins, tendrils that curled and uncurled in patterns you had memorized from a page of the exemplar book. A page that you could see in your mind as clearly as the real vellum before you. Each tendril was laid with the same 3-hair brush, the pressure of your hand so light that the brush barely kissed the skin, and the white walls rose from the page like a faint frost pattern on a window, visible only when the light caught them from the side. The vine work was not essential for the gold, but it created a frame, a boundary that would hold the gold's brightness inside the holy space of the letter, and it was a pleasure to paint these small repetitive curls, each one a little different from the last, each one a small quiet decision, that flowed from your wrist without conscious effort. When the last tendril was complete, you straightened your back and looked at what you had made. The gesso still glistened with its wet sheen, a subtle gloss that would disappear as it dried, and the whole letter stood out from the page like a low relief carved in ivory. You set the brush aside on its tiny porcelain rest, a rest that had been fired by the monastery's potter in the shape of a sleeping cat, and you blew out the candle with a gentle puff that sent a thin line of smoke spiraling upward to join the grey air near the ceiling. The shell of remaining gesso you covered with a small upturned cup to keep it from dust, and the trivet you moved to the back of the desk where it would not be in the way. Then you had sat on the stool, just as you were sitting now, and you had let your hands rest in your lap while the gesso dried, watching the slow transformation of the white from wet to matte, from glossy to chalky, the subtle change that meant the plaster and the glue had bonded firmly to the skin and would now wait, patient and hard, for the gold that you would bring the next morning. And now that morning had come, and the gesso was indeed dry and hard, its surface a perfect bed for the leaf that still waited in its crimson silk, and the memory of its making faded back into the quiet storehouse of your mind as a small, smooth stone drops into still water, leaving only a widening ripple that soon flattens into perfect calm. The gold leaf had waited long enough. You reached for the silk-wrapped booklet with both hands, lifting it from the desk with the same care you would give to a sleeping bird, and you set it directly before you, aligned with the center of the page, so that the journey from the booklet to the letter would be as short as possible. The crimson silk had grown warm where it touched the wood of the desk, and when you loosened the linen ties, the cloth fell open in soft folds, releasing a faint, dry scent of old silk and something else. Something metallic and cool, like the smell of a copper coin held in a closed hand. Inside the silk, the booklet of gold leaves lay nested in a thin parchment wrapper, its edges worn smooth by many years of careful use. The booklet itself was small, no larger than the palm of your hand, made of ruched paper that had been brushed with red ochre to prevent the gold from sticking to its pages. You opened the cover, which was a limp sheet of vellum dyed a deep madder red, and you looked at the first gold leaf that rested inside, separated from its neighbors by a single layer of the rouged tissue. The leaf was a square of pure gold, beaten so thin that the light shining through it turned a strange, unearthly color, a greenish blue like the sky just before a storm. And yet when you tilted the booklet, the surface of the leaf flashed a brilliant yellow orange, catching the grey window light and throwing it back with a gleaming intensity that seemed to belong to a different, brighter world than the one you inhabited. You did not touch the leaf with your bare fingers, because gold this thin would cling to the oils of the skin and tear instantly, but you looked at it for a long moment, appreciating its perfect stillness, its absolute flatness, the way it lay on the rouged paper like a tiny sheet of captured sunlight. The tool you would use to lift the leaf was called a gilder's tip, and it lay waiting for you on the desk, resting on a small wooden stand that kept its hairs from touching any surface. You picked it up now, holding it by the slender wooden handle that had been turned smooth and dark with use. The tip itself was a flat, fan-shaped brush made from the tail hairs of a red squirrel, hairs that were so fine they could hold a charge of static electricity and attract the gold leaf without any adhesive. You had made this tip yourself many years ago, selecting each hair under a bright noon sun and binding them between two pieces of card with a dab of beeswax, trimming the ends to a straight, even edge that had never frayed. You lifted the tip to your mouth and breathed on it once. A slow, gentle exhale that moistened the hairs just enough to enhance their grip, and then you held it over the booklet, the fan of hairs hovering a finger's width above the leaf. The moment of lifting was always the same, a tiny, suspended second in which everything seemed to pause. You lowered the tip until the hairs just brushed the surface of the gold, and the leaf, as if waking from a dream, rose to meet them, clinging with a delicate, all-over adhesion that you felt in your wrist as a subtle change in weight, a presence where before there had been none. You lifted the tip very slowly, and the gold leaf came with it, a square of trembling light that swayed in the air like a petal on a still day. The leaf caught the grey light from the window and transformed it, bending it into arcs of yellow and orange and the palest green, and for a moment the whole scriptorium seemed to fill with a warm golden glow that emanated from that single tiny fragment of metal. You held your breath, not because the leaf required it, but because the habit had been taught to you so long ago that it had become part of the motion, and you began the slow journey from the booklet to the waiting bee. The distance was no more than the length of your forearm, but it was the most careful journey you would make today. You moved your hand with a steadiness that came from years of repeated action, a steadiness that was not a tension but a relaxation, the entire arm swinging from the shoulder in one smooth, unbroken line, while your wrist remained loose and your fingers held the gilder's tip as lightly as a feather. The gold leaf shivered slightly as it moved through the air, its edges rippling in invisible currents of warmth that rose from your body, but it did not tear, because the squirrel hairs held it evenly across its whole surface, supporting every part of it at once. The light shifted and played across the leaf, now revealing the faint crease left by the booklet's fold, now showing a tiny speck of impurity that had been beaten into the gold at the mint, a speck no larger than a grain of dust, but dark as a cinder against all that brilliance. You watched these small details without attachment, noting them as you would note the spots on a familiar leaf in the garden, and you brought the gold closer and closer to its destination. The letter B, with its raised gesso boss already painted with the clear, tacky size, seemed to wait with a kind of patient attention, its white surface catching the reflected light of the approaching gold. When the leaf was a hair's breadth above the gesso, you paused one final time, letting the moment stretch out like a long silent note held by the choir, and then you lowered the tip that last tiny distance until the gold touched the size. The contact was soundless, but you felt it in your hand as a gentle cessation of movement, a soft stop, and you immediately lifted the gilder's tip away, leaving the leaf behind on the gesso like a blessing laid on a forehead. The gold leaf did not lie flat at first. It conformed to the raised shape of the gesso in a rough, tent-like way, its edges standing up where they reached the border of the size. Its center sunk slightly into the hollows of the letter's bowls, and the whole surface was crinkled with tiny, irregular folds that looked like the wrinkles on a dried apple. This was exactly as it should be, for the leaf was too thin and too delicate to be laid in one perfect seamless sheet, and the crinkles and overlaps were part of the beauty of gilded illumination, giving the final burnished surface a depth and a texture that could not be achieved by any other means. You looked at the gold now resting on the B, and you saw that it covered most of the gesso, leaving only a few small gaps at the edges where the leaf had not quite reached, gaps that you would fill later with a second small patch of gold. You set the gilder's tip back on its stand and took up a square of clean silk cloth, a piece of fine white fabric that had been cut from a worn-out liturgical veil and washed many times until it was soft as a breath. You folded the silk once into a small flat pad and placed it over the gold leaf, covering the entire letter and some of the surrounding vellum. The silk settled onto the gold with a gentle, weightless touch, and you began to press it down with your fingers, starting at the center of the letter and working outward in a slow circular motion, a motion like the smoothing of a wrinkle from a sleeve. The pressure was light but firm, enough to push the gold into full contact with the size without cracking the delicate gesso underneath. And as you worked, the crinkles in the leaf gradually flattened out, the edges pressed down against the sloping sides of the gesso boss, and the whole letter began to take on a smooth, continuous surface of gold. The sound of the silk moving over the leaf was the faintest whisper, a sound like a hand brushing a dry leaf, and underneath it you could hear your own slow breathing and the steady, distant murmur of the preaching that still rolled through the valley, a sound that by now had become so familiar that it seemed to belong to the morning as much as the light or the cold. The preacher's voice had taken on a hoarser edge, perhaps tired from the long hours under the open sky, and the crowd's responses came less frequently now, as if the energy of the assembly had settled into a quieter, more attentive phase. You did not pause your work to listen, but the sound was there, a deep, woven thread in the fabric of the silence, and it accompanied the small circular motions of your hand like a distant drum that beat only for you. When you had pressed the gold over every part of the gesso, you gently lifted one corner of the silk pad and peered at the letter. The gold now gleamed with a dull, satiny luster, the surface smoothed but not yet burnished, and you could see where the folds of the leaf had overlapped, creating thin, darker lines where the gold was double thickness. Lines that would mostly disappear under the agate burnisher later. The gaps at the edges were still there, 3 small crescent-shaped voids where the single leaf had not stretched far enough, and you knew that these would need to be patched with the scraps that lay on the rouged paper. You set the silk pad aside, leaving the gold now firmly adhered to the size, and you reached for the booklet to retrieve a second, smaller piece. But before you did that, you allowed yourself a moment to simply look at what you had made. The bee stood on the page in a robe of soft gold, its 2 bowls curving outward with a quiet, regal fullness, its central spine straight and strong, and the whole letter seemed to have risen from the page into a new dimension of dignity and weight. The light in the scriptorium, still grey and muted, could not yet bring out the full brilliance of the gold. But even in this dim illumination the letter glowed with a warm, low radiance, like a candle seen through a horn lantern, and the contrast with the matte cream of the vellum and the dark brown of the minuscule text was so complete, so harmonious, that your eye could not leave it. This was the moment that you always waited for, the moment when the lifeless page took on its first spark of the transcendent, the moment that justified all the hours of grinding and mixing and waiting and tracing, and you let it fill you with a quiet, wordless contentment that asked for nothing more. The distant voice outside paused now, a long silence that stretched out across the valley, and in that silence you heard a single bird, the same blackbird perhaps that sang in the walnut tree each morning. It sung a clear, descending phrase that fell through the cold air like a stream of water dropping from a ledge. The crowd made no sound, and the preacher seemed to have finished one thought and not yet begun the next, and the whole world, for those few heartbeats, was just the song of the bird, the hush of the scriptorium, and the gentle weight of the gold on the page. Then the voice resumed, softer now, as if the speaker had turned to address a smaller group of listeners, and the spell of quiet ended, and you turned your attention back to the small gaps that remained in the gilding. You lifted the booklet and studied the ruched paper, where several fragments of gold leaf lay scattered, leftovers from previous gilding sessions that you had saved for exactly this purpose. These fragments were irregular in shape, some as large as a fingernail clipping, others as small as a grain of wheat, and each one shimmered with its own tiny glow against the dull red of the paper. You breathed on the gilder's tip again, and lifted one of the larger scraps, a triangular piece with one jagged edge where it had torn from the main leaf, and you carried it across to the page on the same slow, suspended breath of movement. The first gap was at the top right curve of the upper bowl, a sliver of white gesso that showed through the gold like a missing tooth in a smile, and you laid the scrap over it, pressing it gently with the tip of your little finger, which you had first brushed against your own cheek, to leave a faint, invisible trace of skin oil for adhesion. The gold fragment settled into the gap and clung there, its irregular edges blending with the larger leaf in a patchy but acceptable join. The second gap, at the lower left curve of the bottom bowl, you filled with a smaller scrap, and the third, a mere pinhole near the spine, you covered with a speck of gold so tiny that you had to hold your breath while you placed it, fearing that the air from your nose would blow it away. When all the gaps were filled, you sat back and inspected the letter again, turning your head slowly from side to side to see how the light struck the surface from different angles. The patches were visible now as slight irregularities in the texture, but you knew that the burnishing later would smooth them out and blend them into the whole, and the knowledge gave you a calm confidence. The confidence of a craftsman who has repaired a small flaw and knows that the final result will still be beautiful. You took the silk pad and pressed the patches down with the same gentle circular motion. Then you folded the silk and set it aside, and you placed the booklet of gold leaves back in its crimson wrapping, tying the linen threads loosely so that the silk would not crease. The first gold leaf was now laid, and the morning had reached its still central hour, the hour when the light did not change, and the monastery seemed to hold its breath between the offices of terce and sext. The scriptorium was warm enough now from your own body heat and the small candle you had lit earlier, and the air had lost its early morning bite, settling into a neutral coolness that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply the temperature of a stone room in late autumn. You could smell the wax of the candle, the clean scent of the salt rag, the faint metallic tang of the gold dust that had transferred to your fingertips, and underlying it all the steady, unnameable odor of old parchment and old stone that was the smell of your life. The distant preaching had become a constant drone again, and you let it wash over you without attention, a sound that was almost a silence, a presence that was almost an absence. Your hands rested on the desk, one on either side of the page, and you looked at the bee with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who has planted a tree and seen it take root, knowing that there was still much to do: the burnishing, the painting of the interior, the delicate vine work, but also knowing that the most fragile moment was past, and the gold would now stay where it belonged, on the page, waiting for the next slow step of its transformation. The morning had passed, stretching its grey hours in a slow, unbroken thread, from prime to terce to sext, and you had spent that entire span of time sitting before the gilded letter in a state of patient rest, moving only to adjust the cushion beneath you or to take a sip of water from the small clay cup that the novice had placed on the window-sill. Now the afternoon had arrived, bringing with it a change in the light that you had been waiting for without impatience, knowing that the sun would eventually find its way through the thinning clouds and deliver the angled golden illumination that made burnishing not only possible, but beautiful. The grey of the morning had slowly dissolved into a paler, brighter white, and then, just after the bell of sext faded from the tower, a soft patch of sunlight had appeared on the stone floor near the door, a rectangle of pale gold that crept across the flagstones with the silent, steady progress of water seeping through sand. The sun had moved since then, and now it entered the scriptorium at a low angle through the western side of the high window, a beam of light that was still cool in tone, but rich with the deeper colour of afternoon, the colour of old honey or light ale, held up to a flame. The beam fell across your desk in a slanting column, illuminating the page and the gilded bee with a clarity that revealed every tiny detail of the gold surface, every crinkle and overlap and tiny fleck of dust that had settled during the long morning wait. You lifted your head and let the light fall across your face for a moment, feeling its faint, distant warmth on your closed eyelids, and then you looked back at the letter, blinking once to clear your vision. The gold had settled firmly onto the gesso during the hours of waiting, the size drying completely and bonding the leaf to the white ground with a grip that would last for centuries. When you touched the gold very lightly with the pad of your smallest finger, it felt smooth and solid, with no give or shift under the pressure, and the tone of the surface was a soft, matte yellow like the breast of a goldfinch in winter. This matte finish was the natural state of freshly laid gold leaf, and it was beautiful in its own quiet way, but the burnishing would transform it into something else entirely, something that seemed to generate its own light from within rather than borrowing it from the sun. The agate burnisher lay where you had left it on the linen cloth, its stone head catching a glint from the sunbeam, the wood of the handle dark and warm. You took it up now, holding it not as you held a quill, pinched between the fingers, but as you might hold a spoon, the handle resting in the hollow of your palm and the smooth curved tooth of the agate extending past your thumb. The stone was cool against your skin at first, cool and dense and perfectly smooth, polished by centuries of running water in its ancient riverbed, long before some craftsman had shaped it into a tool for human hands. The white bands that ran through the grey stone were visible in the strong afternoon light, delicate, cloudy stripes, like the faint streaks in old glass, and you rubbed the tip gently against the square of silk to remove any dust that might have settled there. The process of burnishing was a slow, repetitive act, the circling of the stone over the gold that pressed the leaf into the gesso and aligned its microscopic particles into a single, mirror-like surface. You had been taught this technique by the same blind brother who had taught you to trace the letters, and his voice still lived in your memory as you began. The stone must move like a small boat on a calm lake, round and round without lifting. The pressure firm but never heavy, the speed steady and unhurried. You placed the tip of the burnisher on the upper bowl of the bee, at the very top where the curve began to swell outward, and you started to move it in a tight circular pattern, a spiral that travelled slowly down the face of the gold. The sound that the burnisher made was the first thing you noticed, a soft rhythmic swish that repeated with every circle, a sound like a hand smoothing silk over a polished table or a gentle wave retreating across fine sand. It was a sound so constant and so soft that it quickly faded from your conscious attention, becoming part of the rhythm of your body, a pulse that your breathing fell into without effort. Your hand moved in the same small circles over and over, the muscles of your forearm loosening as you worked, the stone gliding across the gold with a friction so slight that it felt like butter sliding on warm glass. The heat of the friction was minimal but perceptible, a faint, fleeting warmth that rose through the agate and into your fingers before dissipating into the cool afternoon air. As the burnishing continued, the gold began to change. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, a subtle shift in the way the surface caught the light. The matte, buttery yellow of the unburnished leaf slowly altered, gaining a slight sheen at the very top layer where the stone had passed. A shine like the gloss on a quiet pond at dusk. You continued the circular motion, moving the stone down the upper bowl in overlapping spirals, and the shiny area expanded, following the path of the burnisher, like a shadow moving in reverse, darkness giving way to light. The gold on the upper bowl now gleamed with a rich, deep luster, the color becoming warmer and more intense as the leaf compressed against the gesso, and you could see the shape of the window reflected in miniature on the curved surface, a tiny, bright rectangle of light that moved as you shifted your head. The lower bowl came next, and you began at its widest point, the curve that bulged outward toward the right margin of the page, and worked your way inward to the central spine with the same steady, patient circles. The swish of the stone continued, a sound so regular that it barely registered now, and the gleam of the gold grew brighter with each pass until the lower bowl shone with a radiance that seemed almost liquid, as if the letter had been filled not with metal, but with warm, still honey. The tiny overlaps and patches that you had placed earlier, the irregular edges that had been visible in the flat, unburnished gold, began to smooth out and merge into the surrounding surface, not disappearing entirely, but becoming so subtle that only the most careful eye, an eye like your own, would ever detect them. The imperfections were still there, but they had become part of the fabric of the letter, small variations in the depth of the gold that gave it a living, breathing quality no machine could produce. The central spine of the bee was the most delicate part to burnish, because it was narrow and straight, and the stone had a tendency to slip off the edge if you were not attentive. You adjusted your grip on the handle very slightly, shortening your hold so that you had more control, and you began at the top of the spine, where it met the upper bowl and burnished downward in a series of tiny, precise circles that overlapped each other like the scales of a fish. The gold here was just as radiant as on the bowls, and as you moved the stone down the straight line of the spine, you saw your own reflection appear for an instant in the polished surface. A tiny, distorted face with a tonsured head and a calm expression, there and then gone as the angle changed. It was not vanity that made you pause and look again. It was a simple curiosity about how the gold mirrored the world back to itself, and you tilted the burnisher away, letting the reflection vanish into pure, unbroken light. The edges of the gesso, where the gold leaf had stopped and the vellum began, required a different approach. You could not burnish right to the very border of the raised boss, because the pressure of the stone would catch the gold and lift it away from the size if you slipped over the edge onto the unsized parchment. Instead, you used the very side of the agate tip, the curved cheek of the stone rather than its flat point, and you burnished along the perimeter of the letter in a slow, horizontal swaying motion, pressing the gold down firmly against the sloping sides of the gesso, so that the transition from gold to vellum was clean and sharp. This work was finicky but not difficult, and you completed it with the same steady patience that you brought to every task, pausing once to wipe the stone on the silk square, and then resuming, the swish of the burnisher now accompanied by the distant, rhythmic creak of the walnut tree in the cloister garth as the breeze moved its heavy branches. The vine tendrils that you had traced in gesso around the letter were also ready for burnishing, because you had painted them with the same size as the letter itself, and they had received a dusting of gold leaf scraps that morning, tiny flecks and slivers that you had pressed into the gesso with the tip of a fine brush. These gilded vines now awaited the stone, and you moved the tip of the agate along their curling paths with the utmost care, following each tendril as it spiraled outward from the bee and into the margin, the burnisher leaving a trail of bright, gleaming line behind it, like a path of sunlight through a dark forest. The vine work took a long time, because there were many tendrils and each one curved in a slightly different direction. But the rhythm of the work was so steady and so absorbing that time seemed to lose its ordinary shape, becoming simply a series of circles and curves, a continuous flowing present with no beginning and no end. The afternoon light strengthened for a while as the sun found a gap in the thinning clouds, and the beam that fell across your desk became warmer and more golden, intensifying the luster of the gold to a point where it seemed to burn with a slow, internal flame. The letter B now looked like something from another world, a piece of the heavenly city that had been set down gently on the cream-colored vellum, and even the dust motes that floated in the sunbeam seemed to orbit around it, drawn by its glow. You paused your work and simply looked at the illumination for a little while, letting the brightness fill your eyes with a quiet, wordless wonder that never grew old, no matter how many letters you had burnished in your 18 years. This was the moment that made all the scraping of skins and stirring of ink and grinding of pigments worthwhile. The moment when the page became a window, and the light shone through from the other side, the side that you could never quite see, but that you believed in with the same quiet certainty that you believed in the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. The distant preaching had faded almost to silence during the afternoon, the great gathering beyond the hills perhaps dispersing for a meal or settling into smaller groups for quieter talk, and all you could hear now was the tick of the water clock in the cloister, a steady dripping note that counted the hours without urgency, and the occasional cough of a brother in a nearby cell, and the constant, gentle swish of your agate on the gold. The air had cooled again, the brief warmth of the sunbeam already fading as the cloud cover returned and the light flattened back to its familiar pearly grey. But the gold had captured something of the sun and held it, and it would continue to hold it long after the sun had set, long after you had closed the book and gone to your rest, long after the years had turned and the monastery had crumbled and the scriptorium had fallen into ruin. You burnished the last tendril with a final slow circle, and then you lifted the stone from the page and set it down on the linen cloth, flexing your fingers once or twice to loosen the small stiffness that had settled into the knuckles. The gold was now as brilliant as it would ever be, a deep, liquid shine that seemed to have depth as well as surface, as if you could reach your hand into it and touch something warm and living. The letter stood on the page in its full glory, the raised gesso giving it a subtle three-dimensionality, the burnished surface throwing back the grey light in a soft, glowing halo that spilled onto the surrounding minuscule letters and made them seem darker and more humble by contrast. You folded your hands in your lap and sat very still, looking at what you had made with the same quiet, accepting satisfaction that a tree might feel, if it could feel, when it sees its leaves turn gold in the autumn and knows that the work of the summer is complete. The bell for none would ring soon, or perhaps it had already rung while you were lost in the circles of the stone. You could not be sure, and it did not matter. The scriptorium was quiet and still, the 5 empty stools ranged in their 2 rows, the high windows filling with the deepening grey of the advancing evening, and on the desk before you, the illuminated bee shone with a light that was entirely its own, a small, steady beacon that would wait through the coming hours of darkness for the colours that you would mix tomorrow, the deep blue and the verdigris green, and the bright vermilion that would complete the letter and frame it in a garden of painted vines. You covered the page with the linen cloth, laying it gently over the gold so that no dust would settle on the burnished surface during the night, and then you sat for a little while longer in the silent, darkening room, listening to the drip of the water clock and the soft, returning murmur of the crowd beyond the hills, a sound that now seemed to belong to a world that you had never visited, but that you held, somehow, in the palm of your hand, small and distant and perfectly still. The gold work was complete, its burnished surface gleaming softly under the linen cover, and the next stage of the illumination waited in the quiet stores of the scriptorium cupboard where the pigments lived in their jars and boxes. The afternoon had not yet faded into evening, and the light that came through the high window was still strong enough to work by, a steady, cool whiteness that would serve well for the delicate task of grinding colors, where true tone mattered more than brightness. You rose from your stool for the first time in many hours, feeling the slight stiffness in your lower back and the backs of your thighs, a familiar sensation that would ease as soon as you walked the few steps to the cupboard. The stone floor felt solid and cool under your leather shoes, and you moved across the scriptorium with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had been sitting still for a long time and saw no reason to hurry now. The cupboard door opened with its familiar, soft click, the iron key turning in the lock that you had left unfastened since the morning, and the smell of the pigments rose to meet you, a complex, dry scent made of many separate notes, the chalky coolness of slaked lime, the faintly metallic tang of ground copper, the dusty sweetness of madder root, and above all the clean, mineral smell of the lapis lazuli that sat in its own special box on the highest shelf. You reached for that box first, because the ultramarine blue was the most precious of all the colors in the cupboard, worth more than its weight in gold, and it required the most careful handling from the very beginning. The box was made of polished walnut wood, its lid fitted with a small brass hinge and a clasp that snapped shut with a satisfying, precise click when you pressed it. You carried the box to the long, low table that stood against the wall beneath the windows, the table where all the grinding and mixing was done, its surface scarred with decades of pigment stains in 100 subtle hues. The grinding slab waited on the table, a heavy rectangle of porphyry stone that had been brought to the monastery from the quarries of the old empire many generations ago, its surface worn smooth and slightly concave from centuries of use. The stone was a deep, dull red, flecked with tiny white crystals that caught the light, and it was cool to the touch, a coolness that would help keep the pigments from overheating under the friction of the muller. Beside the slab lay the muller itself, a bell-shaped tool of the same porphyry stone, its wide, flat base polished to a perfect smoothness, its narrow top fitting comfortably into the palm of your hand. You picked up the muller and wiped its base with the linen rag, removing any dust that might have settled since the last use, and then you set it aside and opened the walnut box. Inside the box, nested in a bed of raw wool, lay the piece of lapis lazuli, a stone the size of a small hen's egg, its surface a deep, intense blue that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a blue so profound that you could almost feel it in your chest, like the color of the sky seen from a mountaintop or the heart of a flame burning on pure salt. The stone was shot through with tiny veins of gold-colored pyrite that sparkled when you turned it, and here and there were patches of white calcite, impurities that would need to be removed before the pigment could be ground, because only the purest lapis yielded the finest blue. You lifted the stone from its wool bed and held it up to the light, turning it slowly to assess its quality, and you saw that it was a good piece, with more blue than grey, more depth than flatness, a stone that would make a colour worthy of the gold that now sat on the page. The first step was to purify the lapis, a process that you had learned from the Greek treatise on pigments that the abbot kept in his private library, a book so old that its pages had turned the colour of autumn leaves. You placed the stone on a clean linen cloth and took up a small iron hammer that hung from a hook on the wall, a hammer with a flat face no larger than a silver penny. With a single, precise tap, you cracked the lapis into several smaller pieces, the stone breaking cleanly along its natural fissures, and you sorted through the fragments with your fingers, picking out the ones that were the richest in pure blue, and setting aside those that were too veined with white or grey. The rejected pieces would not be wasted. They would be ground into a paler blue for the ceiling of the chapter house when the painters came next summer, but that was not your concern now. The chosen fragments, a small pile of irregular blue nuggets, each no bigger than a pea, you placed in a small marble mortar that stood on the table, a mortar with a matching pestle that felt heavy and cool in your hand. The pounding began, a slow, rhythmic crushing of the lapis fragments under the marble pestle, the sound a steady, muffled thump that echoed softly in the quiet room. You worked with a patient, methodical pressure, reducing the blue stone to smaller and smaller bits, pausing now and then to sift through the powder with your fingers and remove any remaining flecks of impurity that you had missed. The color of the crushed stone was already intense, a dark, gritty blue that stained your fingertips with a fine violet dust, and the smell of the lapis, which had been faint before, now grew stronger, a clean, dry, almost salty scent, like the air near a cliff above the sea. When the fragments had been reduced to a coarse blue sand, you transferred the material from the mortar to the porphyry slab, spreading it in a loose, even layer across the smooth red surface. The mullah now came into your hand, its weight settling comfortably against your palm, and you began the grinding proper, moving the stone in a slow, figure-eight pattern over the crushed lapis. The sound of the grinding was a low, gritty hiss, the sound of stone against stone, and it filled the scriptorium with a steady, meditative noise that you found deeply calming. You added a few drops of water from your clay pot, just enough to make a thin paste, and the hiss softened into a slicker, wetter sound, the blue paste spreading under the mullah in a dark, glossy layer that gradually lightened as the grinding grew finer. Your arm moved in the same eight-shaped path, over and over, the muscles of your shoulder and wrist working in a smooth, unhurried rhythm that required no thought, and the lapis slowly transformed under the mullah, its coarse grains breaking down into an ever finer powder that clung to the porphyry in a velvet-smooth coat. Every few minutes you would stop, scrape the paste back into the center of the slab with a small ivory spatula, and then resume the grinding, the figure-eight motion continuing without haste, without pause, as steady as the turning of the water wheel in the mill stream below the monastery. The distant sound that had been a constant companion all morning and afternoon still murmured beyond the valley, its tone now softer and more diffuse than before, as if the great assembly had broken into smaller groups, or perhaps had settled into a shared meal. The wind had shifted, and now the noise of the preaching reached you only in faint, occasional gusts, a voice lifted momentarily above the rustle of bare trees, and then dropped again into the general hum. Once during a pause in the grinding while you wiped the mullah clean with the rag, you heard a phrase rise clearly from the murmur. Two short syllables that carried on the cold air with an almost musical clarity. Deus vult. The words meant nothing to you in that moment. They were simply sounds, a fragment of spoken Latin that might have been a prayer or a greeting or a line from a psalm, and you did not pause to consider their meaning. The phrase faded as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the rustle of the wind and the distant, answering murmur of the crowd, and you turned your attention back to the slab, where the lapis paste was now so fine that it felt like silk between your fingers when you tested a tiny smear on the back of your hand. The ultramarine required one more step before it could be used, a purification that would separate the finest, brightest particles from the heavier, duller grit. You took a small glass bowl from the shelf and filled it with clean water from your clay pot, then scraped the blue paste from the slab into the bowl, stirring it gently with a clean goose quill until the water turned a deep, cloudy blue. The mixture was set aside to settle, and you watched it with a quiet, patient attention, observing how the heavier particles sank quickly to the bottom while the finest, purest blue remained suspended in the water, a slow, lazy dance of color that looked like smoke rising in reverse. This was the secret of the best ultramarine. The first settling was never the finest blue, and it was the later, slower settling that produced the most brilliant pigment. You let the bowl sit undisturbed, knowing that you would return to it after the other colors were prepared. The verdigris green was the next pigment to be mixed, and its preparation was simpler, but no less absorbing. You returned to the cupboard and found the small earthenware jar labeled Virigei, 5 digeries, in the house scribe's neat brown letters, a jar with a waxed cloth tied over its mouth to keep the moisture in. Inside the jar were thin strips of copper that had been suspended over strong vinegar in a sealed pot for many weeks until they developed a crust of bright blue-green corrosion, the color of a patina on an old bronze bell. You lifted out several of these strips with a pair of wooden tongs, laying them on a clean piece of vellum, and then you scraped the crusted green from the copper with a dull knife, a process that produced a fine crystalline powder that gathered in a small heap on the vellum like green frost. The smell of the verdigris was sharp and clean, a vinegar-sharp scent that prickled in the nose, and the color, when you gathered the powder onto the porphyry slab, was a brilliant, almost acidic green that seemed to vibrate against the dark red stone. The grinding of the verdigris was faster than the lapis, because the crystals were already fine and needed only to be smoothed into an even, paintable consistency. You added a drop of gum arabic from the green glass vial, the thick, honey-colored liquid mixing with the green powder to form a glossy paste that rolled under the muller in dark emerald waves, and the smell of the gum mixed with the vinegar-sharp verdigris to produce a sweet sour scent that reminded you, for no reason you could name, of the apple store in the cellarer's shed in late autumn. The muller moved in its figure-8 pattern, and the paste grew smoother and smoother until it was the texture of thick cream, its color a deep, rich green that would be perfect for the vine leaves and the small decorative details that would surround the bee. You scraped the finished paste into a small shell, covered it with a piece of waxed linen, and set it aside beside the settling ultramarine. The vermilion came last, and it waited in a small, heavy pot made of dark red clay, a pot that had been fired in the monastery's kiln and glazed on the inside to a smooth, glassy finish. Inside the pot was the cinnabar, a mineral that the merchants brought from the mines of the south, a dense, granular substance the color of dried blood. You opened the pot and looked at the cinnabar, noting the way its crystals glittered faintly even in the muted light of the scriptorium, a dull, red sparkle like coals glowing under a layer of ash. The smell of the cinnabar was faint but distinct, a sulphurous mineral odor that you had always associated with the hot springs the brothers sometimes visited for their joint pains. You scooped a small amount of the cinnabar onto the porphyry slab and began the grinding, the muller moving in the same slow, patient figure 8, the red crystals breaking down under the stone into a powder that was the color of crushed rose hips or the breast of a robin. The grinding of vermilion was a slower and more cautious process than the others, because the pigment tended to become too dark if overground, losing its bright, fiery tone and turning into a dull brick red that was useless for illumination. You paused often, testing the fineness of the powder between your thumb and forefinger, adding a drop of water, grinding a little more, testing again, until the red was exactly the shade you wanted, a brilliant, warm scarlet that would sing against the blue and the gold. The distant voice beyond the hills had fallen completely silent now, and the absence of its constant murmur made the scriptorium seem quieter than it had been all day, a deep, full silence that was not empty, but alive with small, gentle sounds, the creak of the roof beams as the day cooled, the soft, steady drip of the water clock in the cloister, and the occasional faraway call of a cow from the home meadow. The light had shifted again, the grey returning as the afternoon wore on, and the scriptorium was growing slowly dimmer, the corners filling with soft shadows that would soon reach the desk and the page. You looked at the 3 shells that now stood on the long table, the deep blue still settling in its glass bowl, the glossy green paste resting under its waxed cloth, and the bright vermilion powder waiting to be mixed with gum. The colours were ready, or nearly ready, and they would wait through the night for the morning when you would take up your finest brush and begin the slow, patient work of painting the interior of the letter and the delicate vine-stem decoration that would complete the illumination. The page with its burnished gold bee lay waiting under the linen cover on your desk, and the colours would join it tomorrow, each one finding its proper place in the design that you held in your mind, a design that had been passed down through so many hands and so many years that it felt less like your own creation and more like a gift you were simply holding in trust for the next generation of copyists who would sit at these desks long after you were gone. You covered the porphyry slab with a clean linen cloth, rinsed the muller in the water pot and dried it carefully, and returned the unused materials to their places in the cupboard, the key turning in the lock with its quiet, final click. Then you walked back to your desk, your steps slower now with the weight of the day's work settling into your bones, and you sat once more on the stool, looking at the covered page and thinking of nothing but the colours that would bloom there tomorrow. The blue and the green and the red, a garden of pigment that would frame the gold and make it complete. The bell for vespers would ring soon, calling you back to the choir, back to the company of your brothers, back to the prayers that gave meaning to all this patient labour. But for now there was only the quiet, the fading light, and the distant, peaceful hum of a world that had finally fallen silent. The morning of the painting arrived without fanfare, a day that looked very much like the one before it, with the same soft grey sky pressing down on the hills and the same cool, damp air moving through the cloister. You woke to the bell of lauds as you always did, your body rising from the straw pallet while your mind still lingered in the last shallows of sleep, and you dressed in the dark with the slow, automatic motions of long habit, feeling the wool slip over your head, the cord settle at your waist, the leather soles shape themselves to your heels. The walk to the scriptorium was the same walk it had been for 18 years, the cloister stones holding the memory of your footsteps, the rosemary and lavender in the garth brushed with a new fall of dew that glittered faintly under the grey light. The door to the scriptorium opened with its oiled silence, and the smell of the room rose to greet you. The same parchment and ink and gum, and now, layered over those familiar notes, the sharp, clean scent of the verdigris, and the faint, salty hint of the lapis that had settled overnight in its glass bowl. You crossed to your desk and lifted the linen cover from the page, folding it neatly and setting it aside, and the burnished gold of the letter B glowed up at you with a warmth that the grey morning could not dim. The gold was still perfect, its sheen unmarred by any dust or scratch, and around it the blank spaces of the letter's interior waited, the two rounded bowls and the narrow pillar of the spine, each one a shallow depression in the raised gesso boss, like the hollows of a small gilded dish. The size that you had painted on the gesso before laying the gold had been applied only to the raised boundaries of the letter, leaving the interior spaces bare and ready to receive their color. You looked at those bare spaces for a long moment, tracing their shapes with your eyes. The upper bowl a neat oval that tapered slightly at the top where it met the spine. The lower bowl a fuller, rounder shape that swelled outward with a gentle confidence, the spine itself a straight channel no wider than the shaft of a quill. The proportions were settled in your mind long before your brush touched the page, a design you had rehearsed in thought 100 times since yesterday. The bowl of settled ultramarine sat on the long table where you had left it. The water now poured off carefully after the final settling, leaving behind a thick, velvety blue paste at the bottom, the color of a twilight sky held in a cup. You carried the bowl to your desk, walking with the careful, level stride that kept the surface of the pigments still, and set it down on the right side of the desk beside the other tools. The brush you chose for this work was slightly larger than the one you had used for the gesso, a brush of 5 squirrel hairs set into a hollowed reed, its tip coming to a fine, pliable point that would hold a droplet of pigment without splaying. You dipped the brush into the water pot, twirled it gently against the side to remove the excess, and then touched the damp tip to the surface of the ultramarine, lifting a small bead of blue that clung to the hairs with a plump, glossy roundness, a tiny planet of color hanging suspended in the grey light. The first stroke was made at the very center of the upper bowl, the brush meeting the bare vellum with a soft, silent touch, and the blue flowed from the hairs onto the page in a small, dark pool that immediately began to dry at its edges, the color lightening as it spread into the fibers of the skin. You worked the pigment outward from the center in a slow spiral motion, the brush describing tiny, overlapping circles that gradually filled the upper bowl, the blue deepening wherever a second pass of the brush added more pigment, staying pale and translucent in the places you had touched only once, creating a subtle, living variation in tone that no flat wash could achieve. The motion of the brush was steady and rhythmic, a small continuous dance of the fingers that you felt in the bones of your hand as a gentle, familiar warmth, and as you worked, the upper bowl slowly transformed from bare parchment into a pool of luminous blue that seemed to hover just beneath the surface of the page, a color so deep and so pure that looking at it felt like looking into still water that had no bottom. The spine of the bee came next, that narrow vertical channel that connected the two bowls and gave the letter its structural strength. You cleaned the brush with a dip in the water pot and a gentle wipe on the rag, then took up a fresh bead of ultramarine, smaller this time, and began to paint the spine from top to bottom in a single, slow stroke that required the utmost steadiness of hand, because the channel was so narrow that the slightest wobble would send the blue over the edge and onto the gold. The brush moved downward with a smooth, even pressure, the blue flowing onto the page in a straight, constant line, and when you reached the bottom of the spine, you lifted the brush and looked at what you had done, observing that the line was true and the color even, the blue sitting neatly inside its gilded boundaries like water inside a stone channel. You exhaled a small breath, the first conscious breath you had taken since the stroke began, and the sound of it was soft in the quiet room. The lower bowl was the largest area to fill, a generous swelling curve that took up nearly half the height of the entire letter, and you prepared for it by mixing a fresh portion of ultramarine in a clean shell, adding a single drop of gum arabic to the paste to improve its flow and deepen its gloss. The gum stirred into the blue with a slow swirling motion of the brush handle, the honey-colored liquid disappearing into the blue and leaving behind a slightly thinner, silkier pigment that would spread more easily across the vellum. You dipped the brush and began at the center of the lower bowl, as you had done with the upper, and the blue bloomed outward in a slow circular expansion, the brush returning to the shell for more pigment and then to the page, each circuit adding a little more depth, a little more richness, the color building through 5 and then 10 and then 20 small passes until the lower bowl was filled with a blue that matched the upper in intensity but had its own individual variations, its own subtle map of lighter and darker patches. But the drying of the paint was a process you had learned to observe with patience, because the ultramarine, mixed with the gum, dried slowly in the cool air of the scriptorium, and you could not paint over a wet layer without disturbing the color beneath. You set the brush down on its porcelain rest, the little sleeping cat that the potter had made, and you folded your hands in your lap, watching the blue change as it dried. The wet gloss faded first, the surface going from shiny to matte in a slow, creeping wave that moved from the edges inward. And then the color itself seemed to settle, the pigment particles finding their final arrangement in the fibers of the vellum, the tone deepening slightly as the last of the water evaporated into the air. A small bubble had formed in the paint near the edge of the lower bowl, a tiny raised dome of blue that trembled with each breath you took, and you watched it without concern, knowing that it would subside on its own as the paint dried, which it eventually did, collapsing into a faint, smooth dimple that would be invisible once the final details were added. While the blue dried, the ordinary sounds of the monastery rose around you, small, gentle noises that filled the space left by the distant preaching which had now fallen completely silent. For the first time in 4 days, the great assembly beyond the hills had either ended or moved on, and the valley was quiet again, holding nothing but the rustle of the bare trees and the occasional call of a crow and the steady, peaceful sounds of the community going about its daily round. The soft, rhythmic creak of the well rope in the garth as a brother drew water for the kitchen. The distant, muffled chant of the office of Terci from behind the chapel door. The faint, rhythmic thud of the baker kneading dough in the bakehouse beyond the wisprectory foot. I could express. When the blue was dry to the touch, you tested it with the pad of your smallest finger, finding the surface smooth and cool, the color fixed firmly in the vellum with no lift or smudge. The letter B now stood on the page in its full splendor, the 2 bowls and the spine filled with this deep celestial blue that seemed to glow against the burnished gold outline, the blue and the gold together creating a harmony that was more than the sum of its parts, a quiet, radiant dignity that belonged to the page and to the psalm and to the centuries of craft that had made this moment possible. The blue was complete, but the interior of the letter still required a few small details before it could be called finished. A thin line of vermilion that would run along the inner edge of the gold on each bowl, a delicate border that separated the blue from the gold and made both colors sing more brightly. You reached for the shell of vermilion paste that you had prepared yesterday, lifting its waxed cloth cover and revealing the brilliant, warm scarlet inside, a red so vivid that it seemed to emit its own heat. The brush you used for this was the very finest you owned, a single stoat hair set into a needle-thin quill, the tool you saved for only the most delicate of lines. You dipped just the very tip into the vermilion, and then, bracing your hand against the wooden bridge that spanned the vellum, you painted a hair-thin red line along the inside curve of the upper bowl, where the gold met the blue, a line so fine that it was barely visible as a separate color, reading instead as a subtle warmth that made the transition between the gold and the blue feel soft and alive, rather than hard and geometric. The lower bowl received the same treatment, the single stoat hair tracing the curve with a steadiness that came from years of practice, and then the spine, two straight parallel lines of red that ran down either side of the blue channel, framing it with a barely perceptible glow. The day had moved along while you worked, the grey light shifting through its slow, almost imperceptible changes, and now the shadows on the wall behind the desk had lengthened into long, soft shapes that told you the afternoon was well advanced. The air in the scriptorium had cooled by another degree, the warmth of the morning now entirely gone, and without thinking about it, you pulled the wool of your tunic a little closer around your shoulders, your hand moving to the collar, and tugging it gently upward, a gesture so automatic that your conscious mind barely registered it. The bell for none rang softly in the chapel tower, a single clear note that fell through the cold air and faded, and you paused in your work to listen to it. The brush held motionless above the page, the moment stretching out into a small, quiet space of pure attention. When the bell had finished its final echo, you returned to the page and considered what remained to be done. The blue interior was painted, the vermilion borders were laid, and the letter B now waited only for the final touches, a series of tiny white dots that would be placed along the central spine, a traditional ornament that you had learned from the exemplar book, and that the old blind brother had always called the Starry Road. You mixed a small amount of lead white in a clean shell, grinding the soft, crumbly cake with a drop of gum water, until it formed a thick, opaque paste, the color of fresh snow. And then you took up the stoat hair brush again, and dipped just the very, very tip into the white. The dots were small, smaller than a poppy seed, and you placed them one by one along the blue channel of the spine, a straight, vertical line of tiny white specks that marched from the top of the letter to the bottom with a perfect, even spacing that you measured by eye and by instinct, a spacing that felt right in your body without any need to count. Each dot was a single precise touch of the brush against the vellum, the white pigment transferring from the hairs to the page with the lightest of contacts. And when the line was complete, the dots seemed to float above the blue like a string of tiny stars reflected in a pool of dark water, a small, quiet detail that no one would ever notice, but that made the letter whole. The afternoon had now deepened into the late, grey hour before Vespers, the light in the scriptorium thinning to a soft, dusty dimness that made the gold and the blue and the red and the white glow with a muted, intimate radiance, as if the page were lit from within by a small, steady candle. You set the brush down on its porcelain cat, stretched your fingers once or twice to ease the small ache that had settled into the joints, and then you sat very still, looking at the finished letter B that gazed back at you from the page, the gold outline shining softly, the blue bowls deep and calm, the tiny red lines warm as a whisper, the white dots floating above the spine like a faint, distant constellation. The work of filling was done, and the letter had become what you had hoped it would become, a small, perfect vessel of color and light that would carry the word of the psalm down through the years long after your own hands had returned to the earth. You covered the page once more with the linen cloth, laying it gently over the letter so that the dust of the night would not settle on the still curing paint, and then you straightened the tools on your desk, aligning the brush, the shell of blue, the shell of red, the shell of white, each in its proper place, a ritual of order that prepared the desk for tomorrow, when you would begin the delicate vine stem decoration that would spiral outward from the B and into the margins. The sound of the water clock in the cloister marked the passing of the minutes, a slow, steady drip that was the heartbeat of the monastery, and you rose from your stool, feeling the familiar stiffness in your back and the pleasant weariness in your hand, the honest, quiet fatigue of a day spent in the service of something beautiful and slow. The scriptorium door closed behind you with its soft, silent swing, and you walked back through the cloister as the first candlelight began to flicker in the chapel windows, the world fading into the blue dusk of a late autumn evening, the gold of the letter B still gleaming in your mind like a small, steady sun. The morning of the vine work arrived with a softer light than the days before, the cloud cover thinning just enough to let a diffuse pearly brightness spread across the sky, a light that seemed to magnify the stillness of the scriptorium rather than dispel it. You had risen at the same bell, walked the same cloister, passed the same rosemary and lavender, now touched with the first faint silver of frost. and you had settled onto your stool with a quiet eagerness that you did not express outwardly, but felt as a small, warm pulse somewhere behind your ribs. The letter B on the page before you was now complete in its essentials, the burnished gold outline enclosing the deep blue bowls with their tiny red borders and the white dots that marched like stars along the spine, and all that remained was the delicate white vine stem decoration that would spiral outward from the letter and into the margins, framing the whole illumination in a garden of pale, curling tendrils. The design for the vine work had been traced in faint gesso lines weeks ago. On the same day you had prepared the ground for the gold, and those lines were still visible to your eyes if you tilted the page just so against the light, a ghostly map of curves and spirals and small stylized leaves that waited to be given substance by the brush. The vine stem decoration was not merely ornamental, though it was certainly beautiful. It served a deeper purpose within the grammar of illuminated manuscripts, marking the capital letter as the beginning of a new and important section of the text, separating the holy words of the psalm from the ordinary page and lifting them into a space of their own, a space that was halfway between the earth of the vellum and the heaven of the gold. You had painted these vines many times before, on many other letters in many other books, and each time the work brought you into a state of quiet absorption that was as close to prayer as anything you did with your hands. The brush you chose for the vine work was your finest. A single stout hair set into a hollowed reed, no thicker than a barley straw, its tip coming to a point so sharp that it was nearly invisible when viewed head-on. You had made this brush yourself, plucking the hair from a winter stout pelt that the cellarer had obtained from a trapper in the mountains. The hair pure white and slightly oily, perfect for holding the lead-white pigment that you would use for the vines. The lead-white paste was already mixed, a small shell of it resting on the desk where you had left it the previous afternoon, its surface covered with a drop of water and a square of damp linen to keep it from drying out overnight. And when you lifted the cloth and stirred the paste with the tip of the brush handle, it was still smooth and creamy, the color of fresh milk, with exactly the right consistency for flowing from the brush in an unbroken line. You drew a slow breath, settled your hand against the wooden bridge that spanned the vellum, and touched the brush to the page at the point where the first vine tendril began, a small dot on the left side of the letter, near the junction of the upper bowl and the spine. The line you painted emerged from that dot as a single slender stem that curved gently toward the left margin, pausing to form a small, tight spiral like a fiddlehead fern, before continuing upward, branching once into a pair of tendrils that wrapped around the upper bowl of the bee from the outside, crossing under the golden outline at the thinnest point of the curve and emerging on the other side to unfurl into a delicate, three-lobed leaf that sat just above the center of the spine. The brush moved with a smooth, even pressure, the white pigment flowing onto the vellum in a continuous, unbroken ribbon that varied in thickness as you pressed slightly harder on the curves and slightly lighter on the straight runs, a variation so subtle that it registered not as a difference in width, but as a kind of visual rhythm, a pulse that made the line seem alive, the lead-white pigment catching the light with a soft, matte gleam that stood out clearly against the cream vellum, a whiteness that was not harsh but calm. The vine work spread outward from the letter in every direction, covering the upper margin and the left margin and a portion of the lower margin, with a network of curling stems that intertwined and separated and intertwined and twined again in a pattern that looked spontaneous but was in fact carefully planned according to the traditional designs preserved in the exemplar book, the same designs that had been painted by monks in the scriptoria of Tours and Rheims and Fulda centuries before you were born. Each tendril followed a path that your hand knew by heart, spiraling outward, curling back on itself, sending off smaller branches that terminated in tiny, teardrop-shaped buds, the whole design growing organically across the page, like a slow, white vine climbing a wall in summer. The brush returned to the shell for more pigment, then to the page, the line continuing without a break, the motion of your hand settling into a steady, meditative rhythm that seemed to slow the passage of time itself, the morning stretching out around you in a long, peaceful expanse of whiteness and quiet. The leaves that adorned the vine were the details that required the most care, small, stylized shapes that you painted one by one along the length of each tendril, each leaf composed of 3 strokes. The central vein first, a straight, fine line drawn in a single quick motion, then the 2 sides of the leaf, two curved strokes that met at the tip and the base, enclosing the vein in a neat, pointed oval. The leaves were not identical but varied slightly in size and angle, some tilting to the left, some to the right, some folded back on themselves as if stirred by a gentle breeze, and the variation gave the vine a natural, unforced quality that made it feel like a real plant rather than a pattern. You painted each leaf with the same unhurried attention, the brush touching the page, lifting, touching again, the sequence of strokes flowing into a quiet, repetitive dance that filled the margins with a garden of pale foliage, 50, and then 100, and then 200, small white leaves that clustered around the bee, like a congregation gathered to hear the psalm. The light in the scriptorium changed by small degrees while you worked, the pearly brightness of the early morning deepening slowly into the warmer, honeyed light of mid-morning as the sun climbed higher behind the thinning clouds. The beam that had fallen across your desk on the previous afternoon returned now, weaker than before but still golden, and it caught the wet lead white of the fresh painted vines, making them glisten faintly for a moment before they dried to their final matte finish. The gold of the bee glowed more warmly under this light, its burnished surface throwing back a soft, diffuse radiance that spilled onto the white vines and seemed to make them glow from within, a gentle, mutual enrichment of color and light that was the whole purpose of illumination. Outside the scriptorium, the silence that had fallen across the valley held steady now, the distant voices that had murmured for 4 days entirely gone. The great assembly dispersed and returned to its scattered towns and villages and farms, where the people would now prepare for whatever journey or task the preaching had urged upon them. What that task was, you still did not fully know or inquire, for it belonged to the world beyond the cloister walls, and you had chosen long ago to place your attention here, on the page, on the brush, on the slow and careful making of beautiful things that lasted. A single bird sang in the walnut tree, the same blackbird, perhaps, that you had heard before. It sang a series of clear, liquid notes that fell through the cold air like drops of water, and the sound was so pure and so simple that it seemed to belong to the vine work, a small living ornament at the edge of your awareness. The novice came quietly while you were painting the tendril that curved around the lower right corner of the bee, a young brother named Felix, who had been given the task of tending to the scriptorium lamps and candles, his feet silent in their soft leather sandals, his face solemn with the importance of his small duty. He carried in one hand a tallow candle already lit, its flame rising straight and yellow in the still air, and in the other hand a small clay dish to catch the drips. You did not look up as he approached, but you felt the slight change in the air as the warmth of the candle reached you, and you heard the tiny, soft scrape as he set the dish on the corner of your desk and placed the candle in its holder beside it, the flame now casting a warm, trembling circle of light across the page that supplemented the fading daylight. The novice stood for a moment, his eyes on the illuminated bee and the spreading white vines, and then he turned and left as quietly as he had come, his footsteps retreating across the flagstones and out the door, leaving behind only the scent of beeswax and the gentle flickering glow of the new flame. The candlelight softened the shadows on the page and deepened the gold, making the burnished letter gleam with a richer, more intimate light, a light that seemed to come from the candle itself, but was in fact only borrowed and returned by the gold. The white vines, now drying to their final opaque finish, stood out against the cream vellum, with a clarity that was almost startling, the lead-white pigment catching the flame light and throwing it back in a soft, pearly glow. The entire decoration now a delicate tracery of pale stems and leaves, and spirals that framed the bee in a garden of pure form. You worked on in the mingled light of the candle and the fading afternoon, the brush moving steadily through the last remaining sections of the vine, the spirals becoming smaller and tighter as you reached the outer edges of the design where the tendrils thinned to a single, fine line and then stopped, leaving the margin clean and empty beyond. The final tendril was the smallest, a tiny curling hook that you painted at the very bottom right of the decoration, a small, graceful curve that looped back on itself and ended in a single white bud no larger than a grain of sand. Judas tradings. The chucksteams på the sounds ashen that support the insförta by what is tent comparable as it was fine my what, the sivness when as before. A stillness that held the memory of all the hours you had spent here, All the spent here, all the stroke night, a bedroken night, with the slockened bright. The shadows in the corners of the scriptorium had deepened into pools of soft darkness, and the candle flame had burned down by half its length, its light trembling now with a slight unsteadiness as the wick absorbed the last of the wax. You pinched the flame out with your wet fingers, a small, sharp motion that left the room in near darkness. The only remaining light, the faint grey glow from the window where the last of the dusk still lingered like water in the bottom of a cup. In that dim, quiet twilight, you covered the page with a linen cloth, smoothing it flat over the gold and the blue and the white vines with a gentle, protective hand. And then you sat for a little while longer, your hands folded in your lap, your breathing slow and even, the scent of beeswax and old stone and drying pigment hanging in the air around you like a blessing. The vine work was complete, the letter was whole, and only the final inspection and the putting away of the tools remained, tasks that would belong to the next hour, the next morning, the next slow turning of the day. For now, it was enough to sit in the quiet dark and listen to the distant, peaceful lowing of the cattle in the home meadow, a sound as old and as steady as the psalm itself. The final morning came with a deep, quiet cold, the kind of cold that settles into the stones of a monastery and stays there, a cold that you could feel in the air even before you opened your eyes. The bell of Lord's rang through the darkness as it always did, its single iron note fording down the stone stairwells and along the corridors, and you rose from your bed with the slow, creaking limbs of a man who had spent many days sitting still, the stiffness in your back and shoulders, a familiar, almost welcome reminder of the work you had completed. You dressed in the dark, the wool of your tunic slipping over your head, the cord settling at your waist, the leather of your shoes cool against your heels, and you made your way through the cloister one last time toward the scriptorium, the rosemary and lavender in the garth, glittering with a heavy frost that crunched faintly under your soles. The scriptorium door opened with its silent, oiled swing, and the smell of the room met you as it always did, the clean scent of vellum, and the mineral tang of old ink, and the faint, lingering sweetness of beeswax from the candle that had burned down to a stub the night before. The high window showed a sky that was still dark grey, the first pale suggestion of dawn only just beginning to lighten the eastern edge above the hills, and the room was filled with a soft, shadowed dimness that made the shapes of the desks and stools seem larger and more solid than they were in full daylight. You crossed to your desk, your footsteps quiet on the flamestones, and you sat down on your stool for what would be the last time with this particular page before you, the cushion accepting your weight with its familiar, soft sigh of dust and feathers. The linen cloth still covered the page, its surface smooth and undisturbed, and for a moment you let your hand rest on it without lifting it away, feeling the slight warmth that the cloth had retained from the previous afternoon, a warmth that now seemed to belong to the letter itself, as if the illumination beneath were gently breathing under its cover. Then you lifted the cloth, folding it once and setting it aside, and the completed letter B looked up at you from the page in the pale grey light of early dawn, its gold outline shining with a soft, steady glow, its blue bowls deep and quiet, its red borders warm as a whisper, its white vine tendrils spreading outward into the margins like frost on a winter window. It was finished, and it was beautiful, and you sat there in the dimness looking at it for a long, still moment, letting the sight of it settle into your memory, a memory that would join the hundreds of other letters you had illuminated over the years, each one distinct, each one a small, quiet life, lived in gold and pigment. The inspection that followed was a ritual you performed many times, a slow, methodical examination of every part of the illumination, searching for any flaw that your hand might have left behind without your knowledge. You leaned close to the page, so close that your breath misted faintly on the vellum before dissipating, and you studied the burnished gold of the outline, following its curves with your eyes from the top of the upper bowl down around the full, swelling curve of the lower bowl, and back up the straight spine to the top. The gold was smooth and continuous, its surface free of cracks or bubbles, the burnishing having produced a mirror-like shine that was broken only by the tiny, deliberate variations you had left in the gesso beneath. Variations that gave the gold a living, breathing quality that flat, machine-perfect gilding could never achieve. There were no gaps, no thin spots where the size had failed to grip the leaf, no places where the agate had slipped and scratched the surface, and you nodded once, a small inward nod of satisfaction, and moved on. The blue interior came under your gaze next, the two bowls and the spine filled with that deep celestial ultramarine that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. You looked for any unevenness in the color, any streak or blotch that might have formed as the pigment dried, but there was nothing. The blue was smooth and consistent, its tone shifting only in the subtle, deliberate gradations you had created by layering the pigment in thin, overlapping strokes. The tiny white dots along the spine, the starry road, were all still in their perfect, even line, each one a small, precise point of light against the dark blue, and the vermilion borders that separated the blue from the gold were still crisp and clean, their warm red glow undimmed by the overnight drying. The vine work came last, and you traced each tendril with your eyes from its starting point at the letter to its final curling tip in the margin, checking for any break in the white line, any leaf that had been painted too thick or too thin, any spiral that had wandered off its intended path. The vines were flawless, their pale, delicate tracery framing the bee with a grace that you had not quite believed you could achieve when you had begun the design weeks ago, and the whole composition worked together with a harmony that made the page feel not like a piece of craft, but like a piece of the natural world, something that had grown rather than been made. There were imperfections, of course, because there were always imperfections. A tiny fleck of gold dust had settled into the blue of the lower bowl during the painting, and was now embedded there, a single speck of brightness against the deep ultramarine that you could see only when you tilted the page to a certain angle. A small smudge of lead white had crept onto the vellum near the end of one vine tendril, a smudge no larger than a poppy seed, invisible to anyone except the maker. A microscopically thin gap had opened between the gold and the blue along one edge of the spine, a gap that would be completely hidden once the book was bound and the page was pressed against its neighbor. You noted each of these tiny flaws without distress, cataloguing them in your mind as you would note the small, familiar cracks in the plaster of your cell wall, the minor imperfections that made a thing human and real rather than cold and perfect. The letter was as good as you could make it, as good as you had ever made anything, and the flaws were part of its life, the small, quiet marks of a hand that had worked with patience and care and love. The inspection complete, you straightened your back and looked at the page one final time in its entirety, the two columns of neat, minuscule text flowing above and below the illuminated bee, the cream vellum glowing softly in the strengthening dawn light, the gold and the blue and the red and the white standing out against the page with a quiet, dignified radiance that asked for nothing. The letter B began the first word of the psalm, "Beat is fear, blessed is the man," and the thought occurred to you, as it often did at the end of a long illumination, that the words and the letter were now bound together forever, the gold and the meaning inseparable, the craft and the prayer united in a single small object that would outlast your own life and the lives of everyone you knew. The putting away of the tools was a ritual as old as the work itself, a slow, methodical process that you performed with the same attention you had given to the painting and the gilding. You began with the brush, the fine stoat hair brush that had painted the vine tendrils, washing it gently in the water pot and shaping its tip with your fingers before laying it on its porcelain rest, the little sleeping cat that the potter had made. The shell of lead white you covered with a drop of water and a square of damp linen, sealing it carefully so that the pigment would not dry out before its next use, whenever that might be. The vermilion and the verdigris and the remaining ultramarine you returned to their jars and boxes in the cupboard, each container closing with a soft click or a gentle press of waxed cloth, the smell of the pigments rising briefly as you opened and closed the cupboard door. The agate burnisher you wiped clean with the silk square and wrapped in its own small linen cloth, laying it in its place on the shelf below the desk, and the gilder's tip you brushed free of any remaining gold dust, its squirrel hairs as fine and as soft as the day you had made it. The quills and the penknife and the horn of ink and the gum arabic vial all went back to their accustomed places, the tools settling into the small, worn hollows they had occupied for years, the desk gradually returning to its state of clean, ordered emptiness. The booklet of gold leaves you wrapped once more in its crimson silk, tying the linen threads with a careful knot, and you returned it to its niche in the wall behind the desk, the small recess where it would wait for the next illumination, the next letter, the next long, slow day of patient craft. The last item on the desk was the linen cloth that had covered the page, and you folded it into a neat square and placed it on the shelf beside the burnisher, where it would be ready for the next morning when you would begin a new page, a new letter, a new quiet conversation with gold and pigment and light. The page itself could not be put away yet, for the paint was still fresh in its deepest layers and needed another day of drying before it could be safely covered and sent to the binder. You left it on the slanting desk, uncovered now, the letter B open to the air and the light, the gold catching the first true rays of the rising sun that had just cleared the monastery's eastern wall and was now spilling through the high window in a soft golden flood. The illumination seemed to wake under that light, the burnished gold flaring into a brilliant, warm blaze, the ultramarine deepening to a richer, more intense blue, the white vines glowing like threads of pure light against the cream vellum, and the whole page became, for a few heartbeats, a small, quiet miracle of color and form that justified every hour of grinding and mixing and tracing and burnishing that had led to this moment. You rose from your stool for the last time, your body feeling light and tired in a clean, honest way, the fatigue of completion rather than the fatigue of effort. You stood beside the desk for a moment, looking down at the page from above, seeing it now as others would see it when the book was finally bound and laid open on the lectern in the choir, a beautiful glowing initial that announced the beginning of the Psalms, a small, bright doorway into the sacred text, a gift from your hands to the hands of the brothers who would sing these words for generations after you were gone. The thought was a quiet comfort, a small steady warmth in your chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with belonging, with the knowledge that you had done your small part in the long chain of craft that stretched back to the first scribes who had copied the scriptures in the deserts of the East, and forward to the unknown copyists who would sit at these same desks centuries from now, their faces and names as lost to you as yours would be to them, but their hands moving in the same patterns, their eyes studying the same exarchs, their hearts holding the worth. The candle stub on the corner of the desk had burned out completely, its wax pooled in a small white circle on the clay dish where the novice had set it, and the last curl of smoke had long since dissipated into the cold air. You picked up the dish and the spent stub, meaning to return them to the lamp-room on your way to the refectory for the morning meal, and then you paused and looked around the scriptorium one final time, seeing the 5 empty stools ranged in their 2 rows, the high windows filling with the clear, pale gold of the winter morning, the long table under the wall where the porphyry slab and the mullar and the glass bowl of water sat waiting for their next use, the dark oak cupboard with its jars of colour, and boxes of the silence inside the scriptorium was complete, a deep, holding quiet that seemed to press gently against your ears, and you stood within it for a little while, breathing slowly, letting the peace of the room fill you up and settle into your bones. The heel of your leather shoe made a soft, regular sound on the flagstones as you walked to the door, a sound you had heard thousands of times but that now seemed new and distinct, each step a small clear note in the quiet. You pushed the door open and stepped into the covered passage, the cold air of the cloister hitting your face with a fresh, clean bite, and you closed the door behind you with the flat of your hand, feeling the grain of the oak smooth and familiar under your palm. The cloister was empty at this hour. The brothers all gathered in the refectory for the morning meal, and you walked alone through the arcade, the frosted rosemary and lavender glittering in their beds, the walnut tree and the garth standing bare and black against the pale winter sky, the well-rope creaking softly in the breeze that stirred through the central garden. The world outside the monastery walls was completely silent now, the distant preaching that had murmured through the valley for 4 days entirely gone, leaving behind only the ordinary, eternal sounds of the countryside, the call of a crow from the bare branches, the distant lowing of the cattle in the home meadow, and the faint, almost inaudible trickle of the mill stream running under its thin crust of morning ice. You found yourself standing still in the middle of the cloister, the clay dish and the candle stub held loosely in your hands, your face turned upward to the pale grey-white sky, where a single, high cloud drifted slowly toward the east, its edges tinged with the faintest wash of gold from the rising sun. Is medid Serbia. Is stanibidithievat smitesinid. feeling the quiet satisfaction of a task completed and a day begun, a day that would be very like the day before it, and the day of bells and prayers and meals and work, a day of small rifted trasted, the small wits named, a day of the small show to dry tethagennens. For you did a dreit, at the just ida het, the bell for the morning meal rang softly from the chapel tower, a single, muted note that called you back to the company of your brothers, and you turned from the garden and resumed your walk, your footsteps carrying you across the cloister and through the archway and into the narrow corridor that led to the refectory, the scent of warm bread and barley porridge growing stronger with each step, the low murmur of voices rising to meet you, the door opening to reveal the long, candle-lit hall where the brothers sat in their silent rows, their brunsts their bay. You took your place among them, setting the candle dish on the side table where the novice would collect it, and you bowed your own head over your bowl, and gave thanks for the meal and for the morning, and for the quiet, steady work that filled your days with purpose and peace. The scriptorium waited behind its close the mirth. The scriptorium waited behind its close the silence, until you returned to begin the next page, the next capital, the next slow, careful passage through the psalm, and then the page after that, and the page after that, and the page after that, and the burn ends its peaceful morning. With the porridge warm and the brothers silent around you in the silent roast in Kimmel dispel it, the bell that stelkil ralted and said, Belt el helcher well, belts is a feedback very that can't dispel it's faithfully.